Hello, my name is Michael O'Keefe, aka The Movie Wist. If you enjoy this interview and want to hear more top-notch film industry conversations, please press the thumbs up, subscribe to this channel, and hit the bell to stay in the know. Hello, Kier-La Janisse. I was mesmerized with your documentary, Woodlands Dark and Days Bewitched. It is quite long, and I'm wondering, how long did it take you to create this project?
It was about 2.5 years from start to finish. We started working on it in July of 2018. And, it was just getting refined over and over again through that time. At one point, I had a rough cut that was like 5 hours long. So 3 hours, we were actually able to shave 2 hours out of it to get the final version at just over 3 hours. So, but there's still so much, it was hard to cut stuff because there's so much. Every time you kind of explore a certain avenue, it opens up all these more questions and stuff. So.
Okay. How would you define folk horror?
I mean, the most basic definition of it is often folk horror that takes place in a rural environment that somehow deals with folk customs, folk practices, insular communities, and the value systems that develop within those insular communities. And sometimes any iteration of those things, right? So sometimes it will be much more about the sort of weird community and less about the kind of occulty stuff, So sometimes I guess the movies people would consider the most folk horror are movies that have kind of all these things. They've got some sort of pagan or folk, superstitious folk beliefs represented. They've got the insular community and they've got the rural environment. So those are kind of the basic things.
Okay. I would love to get some thoughts from you on the British horror film Blood on Satan's Claw, as originally this was going to be a documentary on that Blu-ray.
Yeah. So Blood on Satan's Claw is one of the three films that are considered like the unholy trinity of folk horror. And this was a term that was coined by Jonathan Rigby and Mark Gatiss on Mark Gatiss's BBC television series, A History of Horror, in 2010. And so they were referring to three films, The Wicker Man, Blood on Satan's Claw, and Witchfinder General as the Unholy Trinity, where they saw those as kind of key folk horror films that a lot of the other folk horror films were touching back to in some way, that they had, and they're all very different films from each other in a way, but that they all had these kind of tendrils that went out, and that a lot of the British folk horror films would connect to them in some way, like thematically. And Blood on Satan's Claw is a movie that it's interesting because for a long time it was definitely the least known of the three films. Now it is kind of, taken precedence and it's much more celebrated now. And there are Blu-rays, like Severin Films put out a Blu-ray, and the UK, they have a brand new Blu-ray of it as well. So there are beautiful copies of it that exist. But it's a movie basically about, somebody finds these strange remains in a field, and, they end up with a group of what would be considered high school kids now, but they're in kind of the medieval version of high school. And this kind of youth population that gets kind of possessed by this, satanic artifact, and kind of rebels against the authority in the village. And also, they become very sexualized and stuff. And originally it was three stories. Originally, when that film was conceived, it was supposed to be a trilogy of three, like an anthology film. And so Robert Wynne Simmons, who wrote the script for it, he had originally written three different stories, which is why, like, some people have commented on how they notice that certain threads don't go anywhere and stuff. And it's partially because it was originally three different things that they ended up weaving together into like one narrative. But yeah, it's a really interesting film, and it's got a character, the central character, Angel Blake, played by Linda Hayden, is kind of like an iconic folk horror character. Like her image with these, branches in her hair is kind of like the quintessential folk horror image, I think, that, other than maybe the Wicker Man itself, like the actual flaming Wicker Man, that's probably the most iconic folk horror image. But I would say the image of Angel Blake is just after that.
I rewatched it a few days ago, And that soundtrack is incredible too.
Oh yeah. I love it. We did interview Mark Wilkinson, who did the score for Blood on Satan's Claw, but we ended up taking the entire music section out. So we had originally a whole chapter that was all about the music of folk horror, dealing with some of the scores where we had interviewed some of the composers, and then also dealing with some of the other kind of weird electronic music that was used in a lot of the BBC television folk horror productions that were made in-house. And the influence of those things on current musicians, those sounds, the way that they were adopted by, around like 2010, or in the early 2000s or whatever, were kind of adopted by a lot of British bands that were kind of mining a lot of the imagery and sounds from that time. But that section ended up being much more kind of production history based, of people talking about the actual instruments and the actual sounds and how they made certain sounds and stuff. And it didn't really fit with the rest of the movie in terms of because of the thematic discussion that was the focus of the movie. So we ended up taking that whole section out, and it is now going to be like a standalone extra on the Blu-ray when it comes out.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
So I love how seamlessly it seems, at least, you go from one topic and film to the next. So tell me how you construct your documentaries with so many pieces with that flow.
Yeah. Well, the first thing was, I would like to say the first thing was a script, but I did not actually start transcribing and writing things as a script until probably halfway through, or like until July of last year. So originally I had done a rough cut. I was editing it myself, and I knew that I wanted to have like chapters, right? And so the chapters were kind of like my first organizing principle. Was like, I knew that, the Unholy Trinity was going to be here. And then we had another section that was just going to be focusing on the wealth of British folk horror films, because there are so many of the foundational folk horror films that are British, or from the British Isles. And so I knew that was going to be there. And originally we did have a section on psychogeography separately, like landscape stuff. And then we ended up folding that into the other sections. But so originally it was like setting up these chapters, and each section kind of had its own approach. So like the British signpost section is very much about naming the films and naming the creators, who were kind of most known for these things. And then like the American section is very focused on on colonization and the migration across the country, and how each different region ended up having its own kind of folk horror based on whatever the sort of conflicts and anxieties were of those regions. And then the part of the international part is probably the most blended part, where different countries are blending together as we're talking about different types of stories and how they correlate to, countries on opposite sides of the world, how they will be investigating similar types of stories or narratives or problems, like through their own cultural lens, but how they have certain issues in common. And so all of that was happening, but July of last year, I started just writing it as a script. I had never considered having a writing credit on the film. Actually, I don't even know if there is a writing credit on the film. I think it just says directed and produced by me. But so originally it was not going to have a writing credit because this is my first documentary, and I had never really understood how you write a documentary when you're like, it's like, well, everybody's just saying what they say when you interview them. How is that written, But I realized it is written, because there's a lot of structuring happening. There is definitely like narrative threads that are being created by what I choose to put where. And so by the end of it, I really did feel like this was a written project, So once we had the script, which my editor, Winnie Chung, she's the editor that came on in July of last year. My first editor was a guy named Benjamin Shern, and then he had to leave the project originally because of an injury, and then one of his own projects got greenlit where he was producing it, so he moved on to that. And Winnie took over as producer, she is a co-producer now, but she took over as editor, and she was used to working from a script, so that the script process kind of happened when she came on, and she wanted to have kind of everything written out so that she could refer to it in kind of minute detail, so that she could just focus on imagery and like how to to evoke those images based on what people are talking about, you know? And so, yeah, so it was a lot of writing and rewriting and restructuring. The basic structure of the movie never changed. But within those sections, there was a lot of rewriting to try to get everything to flow better, you know, because I would write a script and Winnie would edit part of it and we'd watch it and we'd just be like, there's just a disconnect happening. This is just not, your brain is not connecting these two things, you know, so we need to make this connection clearer somehow. And so then I would go back to the script and maybe move things around and would be like, okay, let's try this. And then we'd be like, okay, that makes sense. That works better, you know? And so it was a constant process of that, of like refining the script and kind of moving stuff around within the section so that we could try to get as seamless of a flow as possible.
Well, I really felt it. I think it works from chapter to chapter and everything like that. But anyways, it was nice to see Emma Tammy and Teresa Sutherland in this project, as I got to interview them in Toronto back in 2018 about their project, The Wind. And I was curious to know what are some of your favorite contemporary examples of folk horror?
Well, so The Wind I really loved. Obviously, there are not a lot of films where we actually interviewed people about their own films in the movie, you know, so they were like one of the rare examples where we did that. And that's, you know, partially because I really love the film and I feel like it really encapsulates that thing we're talking about migrants, you know, moving into the country and the customs they bring with them. But other kind of recent folk horror films, there was a Russian film from last year. There are bits of it in the movie. We don't showcase it a lot because the movie hasn't come out, you know, and so it still has to like have its proper festival run and stuff, but it's a Russian film called Ichi, and it's from the far east of Russia, you know, and it's from this very kind of underserved area of Russia in terms of, you know, filmmaking and documenting the culture there. And that film was really interesting because it actually tied in a lot with the same things that were in like Demon, the Polish film, and the La Llorona, the 2019 one that we talk about. We sort of make this comparison between Demon and La Llorona and the Australian film, The Dreaming, you know, in terms of like how these films are dealing with these genocides, you know. So Ichi is a film that would have fit into that discussion really well. And the only reason we didn't cover it more was we just didn't want to give too much away from it because the movie hasn't had its chance, you know, in the festivals yet. But we wanted it to be acknowledged. So we wanted it to be there so that people would hear of it and want to look it up, you know. But that was a film that I really loved of a lot of recent ones. Maddie Doe's film, The Long Walk, is really amazing. And that again is like there's a shot of it in the movie and that's it. We don't actually talk about it. I'm trying to think of what else is
really like Midsummer.
Oh yeah, Midsummer. Yeah. Midsummer is great, but I feel as though that goes without saying.
Right. Yeah.
There are certain movies like The Witch and Midsummer. It's like, of course, they're amazing, but it's like everybody kind of knows that. Yeah, I mean, it's from 2015, but Demon, that Polish film that I mentioned, is definitely one of my favorites. You know, and there's just so many. It's kind of, but yeah, I would definitely just say, you know, and there was a film that we forgot to put in, which is The Hallow. So like The Hallow, I had actually written it in the editing of the project file. I put a title card that was like, don't forget The Hallow, you know? And it kept being put in like script versions where I'd list, you know, new films and I would list it. And somehow we still missed it. You know, it's not mentioned and it's not in there. Border is another more recent one that's really great. That's in there. Yeah, there's so many. And it's interesting when you start looking at the more recent ones, especially internationally, how different they are. And especially like how different they are from the core British folk horror films, you know, like to the point where I'm sure many of the British scholars of folk horror will look at some of these films and be like, is that folk horror? You know, like that, does that fit with like what our idea of folk horror is? But that was part of what I wanted to do with the movie, was like kind of challenge what one country had presented as folk horror and not necessarily use it as like a template that the rest of the world had to follow, to use it as a starting point and to use it as like, okay, this is a culturally specific thing in Britain and it's very prolific, it's huge, you know. But there are also culturally specific manifestations of it in all these other countries that look very different, that are more related to their own issues regionally,
Who are some of the seminal figures in literature that folk horror is in debt to in cinema? And could you recommend a couple of books?
Well, I mean, there's definitely, Jonathan Rigby mentions in the, okay, so some of the ones that kind of have that story of the person coming to the small village, whether it's like a researcher or a scholar or an archaeologist, or there's some sort of like seeker, who's like coming to a village and who encounters these strange people and their weird beliefs. And, so I mentioned in the film, there's Eleanor Scott's Randall's Round and Grant Allen's Pallinghurst Barrow. They are both about that. There's also the book Ritual by David Pinner, which is the book that The Wicker Man was based on.
Oh.
So it is not, it's interesting if you read it compared to The Wicker Man, you can tell they departed from it quite a bit. I think they bought the rights to the book and then they realized it was, I think Anthony Schaffer said something like he felt the book was maybe a bit too self-congratulatory, like it was too like thinking it's too clever or something. And it definitely has a lot of Black humor and stuff like that in it. In some ways it does feel very different, but it is, it's like a missing girl and, somebody goes to this village to investigate that. And they're investigating all these weird pagan rituals that the children in the village are participating in. But it is, so as much as The Wicker Man departs from it, I think it is still a really important book for fans of this stuff to check out. And then there's also, Algernon Blackwood, Jonathan Rigby, I think, brings up The Willows and The Wendigo. And The Willows especially is one that I think that fans of this stuff really love. And M.R. James, so who the Ghost Stories for Christmas on the BBC were originally all intended to be based on M.R. James stories. They ended up expanding from that mandate, but so like M.R. James' story, "Oh, Whistle and I'll Come to You, My Lad," was made into the Jonathan Miller play for today, "Whistle and I'll Come to You," so it should have like a shortened name. And then that prompted the creation of the Ghost Stories for Christmas. Whistle and I'll Come to You and A Warning to the Curious, The Stalls of Barchester Cathedral. These are all like just elemental, M.R. James short stories that are like really important to folk horror. But yeah, we didn't really, so we tended to focus on movies and television in the thing. So we bring in literature a little bit just to show like that this tradition predates, this wave of movies, but obviously we don't go into the literature super deeply, just as we don't go into the music super deeply. It is, but it was important to bring up because it's important to show that there are these precedents that go back like at least 100 years before these movies became popular. Like there are certain story types that already existed in that literature. Oh, The Black Reaper, Bernard Capes, The Black Reaper. That book is another folk horror book that people would want to check out.
Kier-La, thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it. It's a wonderful documentary. But before I let you go, could you tell us when we can expect the Blu-ray from Severn Films?
Well, that I can't tell you exactly because South by Southwest is its very first festival screening. It's the world premiere. And so we are planning other festival screenings. We're planning a festival run for it. And the release is probably going to be determined by that festival run. So sometimes, the genre film festival circuit goes up till November, so we could be playing it in festivals all the way up till then, or we could decide earlier than that, okay, we've had enough festivals, but either way, I would say we definitely want it to play festivals. So we want to have that experience. And we're especially hoping that like with COVID, that if it's still playing in festivals in September or October, maybe we can actually go to them in person, So we're hoping that travel opens up and becomes safe before this movie reaches the end of its festival run so that we can actually see it with an audience and experience that, especially because this is my first film. So I really want that experience of going to a festival in person. So we're probably going to try to milk the festival run and then release it sometime either in the fall or early spring, I'm guessing, but it's but it's all up in the air. A lot of times with Severin, as you know, it's like opportunities will sometimes change the release dates of things, right? So there will be opportunities either for the films theatrically that push back the release dates, or suddenly new elements or materials will become available that we need to work around. So usually if there's any delay in Blu-ray releases, it's usually for a good reason. It usually means that we have something extra that we got a hold of, that we're trying to get into that disc. So, but I don't think it'll be too long. So I think that fans everywhere will hopefully be able to see it at their own regional festivals too. That's the hope anyway.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. We'll stay tuned and wish you nothing but good things.
Thank you.